What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today we are going to go over the reproductive system. We're going to start off with the basics. We're going to move through the female reproductive cycle, all the parts, the anatomy, ovulation, and then we'll move into the male. Um, and that will conclude this lecture, and then we will move on to the next one. So, obviously, most likely you've probably talked about this in lab. If you haven't, you totally will. You have male and female reproductive organs. We will discuss them all. Obviously, the main organs that we're discussing are the ovaries for the female and the testes for the male. There's a bunch of other structures that are involved in the major roles of these reproductive systems, respectively. And we will discuss them. But mainly, we're going to talk about gamete production. And a gamete is a sex cell. And as we'll see on the next slide, these sex cells have half the number of chromosomes as a regular somatic cell. So a somatic cell is a regular body cell. These cells are what we call 2N, aka they have 46 chromosomes, and gametes are N, which means that they have 23 chromosomes. So when we take a look at the process of oogenesis and spermatogenesis, these two processes are the production of gametes. So if you make a sperm and it has one N or 23, and you make an egg that is one N or 23, upon fertilization, we will form one cell that is 2N, right? Obviously, the sperm fuses with the egg. We call this process fertilization, and we'll dive into some detail with that probably in the next lecture. Once this egg or secondary oocyte is fertilized, it will implant right into the uterus, and we'll talk a lot about the uterus. And then the cells will divide via mitosis, and the one cell becomes many cells, and then those cells become many more cells. And then basically we have the embryo and fetal growth, which we will talk about in the next one as well as obviously birth, right? So this is the process. Primarily today, we're going to be talking about oogenesis, and we'll get a little bit into fertilization. Starting off with the female reproductive system. Obviously, you have a nice little video, kind of summarizes the whole thing. Highly recommend you check it out. We will walk through the anatomical structures, starting with the ovaries, right? You have two ovaries. What happens in the ovaries is basically the maturation of the egg, more or less. And we'll discuss that whole process. Once a month, the secondary oocyte is ovulated. It will go down the fallopian tube and enter the uterus. If no fertilization had occurred, right, kind of this inner layer of the uterus as well as that oocyte will be removed. This happens about once a month, more or less, and we'll discuss that process. Physically what happens as well as hormones that are involved in regulating this process. The entrance/exit to the uterus is called the cervix. We'll talk a little bit about that. And obviously, the entrance or exit of the entire system is the vagina, right? We can see here from a sagittal view a little bit more detail of structures, right? As stated, that ovaries here, we have the uterine, also known as the fallopian tube. I call it the fallopian tube, but you will also see it be called the uterine tube that connects to the uterus. The uterus has three layers. We'll talk about that and what those do. obviously the cervix, and then the vagina, right? Out here, you have a couple other structures like the clitoris and some labia, which are the outer layers. And not that we're discussing this now, because you do in the future lecture. You also have a bunch of urinary structures, right? So those were reproductive structures. The urinary structures will be here, the urinary bladder, the urethra, etc. In the female, these structures are separate from the reproductive. And in the male, we'll see that there's kind of a hybrid between the urethra's role in reproduction and in urination. That obviously we will discuss in the future. So let's break down each one. Looking first at the vagina, serves as a passageway, primarily for childbirth, right? That's the pathway that the baby's going to take. If it's growing in here, it's going to come out the cervix. In addition, menstruation, once a month when we remove the inner layer of the endometrium, as well as that secondary oocyte, it's going to come out this way, as well as for sexual reproduction, the penis, right? That's how the sperm's going to get in through the cervix, into the uterus, and possibly fertilization in that fallopian tube. Possibly not. There are three general layers of the vagina. You have the mucosa, muscularis, and the adventitia, kind of just like that outer layer. The mucosa is composed of the epithelium and an additional layer called the lamina propria. The epithelium is made of stratified squamous epithelium, multiple layers of flat cells, not keratinized like you have in your skin, so it's a little bit softer. And another very, very important component is that the vagina produces organic acids. So the environment in general is acidic, and this is to help prevent bacteria and microbial growth because you don't want that, right? We'll talk about during sexual reproduction some components that help maybe neutralize that acid or as that acid changes throughout the menstrual cycle, allowing for a somewhat more favorable environment for sperm. But in general, those acids are important to help prevent bacterial and microbial growth. The cervix, right? Obviously is this component, right? As we basically enter in through the vagina, the next thing that we're going to hit is the cervix, right? Around ovulation, like we just talked about, you want to make the environment more favorable for sperm, right? Obviously, probably not every month most individuals are probably not trying to get pregnant. Some are, obviously. But either way, the body doesn't know that, right? So it's going to prepare the uterus and the internal environment by thinning out the mucus. The mucus would make it harder for the sperm to swim. So we thin out that mucus and we change the pH a little bit more alkaline. So it's a little bit more favorable and a little bit easier passage, if you will, for sperm. At other times, that mucus is way thicker and is going to make it very, very difficult for the sperms to swim. And it creates kind of what we call the cervical plug because there's no fertilization that can occur there because there's no oocyte. The uterus in general, so we're working our way in, vagina, cervix, uterus, has three layers. The innermost layer that we will talk about a lot is called the endometrium. The middle layer is called the myometrium. That's the muscular layer that's responsible for contracting and helping to remove kind of the endometrial layer that gets released monthly. And then the perimetrium is basically the serosa or the outermost layer. A key thing here is that that endometrium has two layers, right? And we'll take a look at that because we're going to see throughout the uterine cycle. So the hardest part about the female reproduction, in my opinion, is that you have multiple cycles going on at the same time. So it's still the 28 days. But the question is, are you looking at the uterus? Are you looking at the ovary? Are you looking at body temperature? Or are you looking at hormones? So we'll pull up a couple slides soon, and I'll try to explain to you the difference as far as things happening at the same time, but from different perspectives. So a key thing here, this is your time frame. Most of the time we approximated about 28 days, but you will see every time we go through and talk about some hormones, one of the key factors is which hormone is in the highest concentration. So you can see during the beginning, and I'll just kind of draw this down here. In the beginning of the cycle, there's low levels of progesterone, and estrogen's the more dominant hormone, right? This is where ovulation occurs, right here, about the middle-ish. So as that estrogen is the dominant hormone, right? And there's various reasons we'll talk about why it starts to increase, but you can see that this correlates to an increase in the thickness of the functionalis layer, right? This picture is showing you the endometrium. This whole thing here is the endometrium. So you can see that stratum functionalis is thickening throughout this course, aka built by high concentrations of estrogen in the beginning. So we'll try to simplify this. Estrogen in the beginning promotes that growth. After ovulation, right, from here to here, see if I can clean that up a little bit for you there. From here to here, you can see that it's the most thick, and it's being maintained. This is the point here post-ovulation where fertilization would occur. And if you did have a fertilized zygote, that little cell mass would need to implant into the uterus. So it's basically preparing for that, right? If no fertilization occurs, and we'll talk about the key hormone that's involved in that, we need to reset, right? So we will have the proliferative phase is basically under the influence of estrogen. It promotes the thickening, if you will, of the stratum functionalis. Then we have the secretory phase where we start getting all these glands and preparation for implantation. That's when it's the thickest. And then if no implant or if no fertilization takes place, then you have your menses where basically that whole functionalis kind of clears out. And then we reset it to do all over again next month. So two key factors, well, a couple key factors. Obviously, the estrogen is promoting that proliferative phase. And then the maintenance during that secretory phase is from both estrogen and progesterone. So you could see here kind of estrogen is the main dude, then progesterone takes over. However, there's still high levels of estrogen. So both of those, very, very important to promote that secretory phase. And again, this is just looking at the endometrium. Cool. Shows you a little histology slide of those secreted materials, endometrial glands, etc. So here, and we kind of talked about it, right? You will see that it's just in a slightly different order, right? So this was the proliferative phase we talked about first. The green, should probably do it color-coded. The green is estrogen. That's what the E means. And the P is progesterone, right? That's the blue. So I'll kind of do it in the same order we did before. During the proliferative phase, we see that estrogen is the highest. That promotes the initial growth of the functionalis. Progesterone's low. As we go to the secretory phase, so it's quite in my way, we will notice that progesterone is now the highest. However, there's still decent amount of estrogen in there, right? Once we need to reset, we see that progesterone decreases, as does estrogen. It triggers a series of events that will result in the menses shedding and repair of that stratum functionalis, right? So it's pretty much the same thing that we just looked at, with a slightly different picture of hormones, right? Same hormones, same levels, just a slightly different picture. And it explains it down here very nicely. Cool. That's the uterus. Once I should say, egg is ovulated, right, from the ovary, it rolls down the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube is where we usually see the meeting of the sperms and the egg, and where basically fertilization occurs, right? That usually occurs not in the uterus, not in the vagina, but fertilization usually occurs in the fallopian tube. There's the ampulla, which is kind of that middle section. And then you have these fimbriae, which are these finger-like projections that help kind of capture the ovulated oocyte that is coming out of here. Say it looks like that. Boom. And then that egg moves or oocyte moves down. Obviously, it will, if unfertilized, enter the uterus and be expelled via menses that we just discussed. Now we get into the ovary. So we moved in vagina, cervix, uterus, fallopian tube, the little fimbriae. Now we have the ovary. The ovary is this is the organ, right? This is where most of the stuff is happening. Obviously, that uterus has very important role. And the ovary in general has an inner section that we call the medulla and an outer section, which we call the cortex. Inside this ovary, I'm showing this picture because this is a confusing part for a lot of people. Inside this ovary, you have oogenesis. What this is the production of an egg, right? We call this egg that will be produced a secondary oocyte. The pathway, if you will always start off with a gonium. Whether we're talking about sperm or egg, the oogonium is the initial cell. They are 2N. These are kind of like the starting point, if you want to think about that. They do mitosis. So you make a bunch of them that are very similar. And then as they enter this oogenesis process, right, they initially will turn into primary oocyte. So the general pathway is you're going to have a gonium to a primary, whether it's a sperm or egg cell, it doesn't matter. Oogonium, primary oocyte, and then basically we stop, right? So you will have in the ovary, if you will, and we'll see on the next slide, a huge stash of primary oocytes. A lot of them. Once puberty hits, then we start having the primary oocyte complete prophase 1, and kind of go through meiosis 1. This is where these primary oocytes will turn into a secondary oocyte. Now, what's significant about this is we only want to make one egg. when we talk about spermatogenesis, I'll show you every time we do this, we make four, right? Because that's the math. Here, we only want to make one secondary oocyte. So what we produce are polar bodies. So we undergo, initial meiotic division, and we produce a secondary oocyte and a polar body. The polar bodies are gotten rid of. We don't need that, right? We just basically needed to have that N, if you will. So those polar bodies, bye-bye. We have our secondary oocyte now. This cell is what is ovulated, right? The only time that this will actually complete its meiotic division is if it gets fertilized, right? If it gets fertilized, you release that second polar body. We don't need him. And you form, finally, the zygote. Keep in mind, this below the line only happens if fertilization occurs. Otherwise, you just have that secondary oocyte, hasn't completed meiosis. It gets ovulated, it gets released. Goodbye, and then we restart. So a key factor here is that secondary oocyte completes meiosis upon fertilization. And then we form our zygote. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about that guy and kind of what happens next. But what makes this chart confusing is that's just one cell. That's just our secondary oocyte. The oocyte is the one egg. However, in the ovary, we have something called follicular, follicular development. So what a follicle is, now I'm reluctant to try to draw it up there. There you go. Follicles are your cell that we just talked about. And in addition to that, there's groups of cells helping it out, growing around it. So the main difference is your oogenesis is specifically that egg. All these pictures you're going to see are not just that egg. All the pictures we're going to see as we move forward are primordial follicles, primary follicles, mature follicles, ovulation, and the corpus luteum. So you could see here, if this was our oocyte, these things have cells that are hanging out around them. Sometimes they even have more cells hanging out around them, right? So this egg is inside of the follicle, and the follicle is the group of cells in addition to the egg. So basically, most of the time when you see the ovary, it's not the best picture, but it's all good. We're going to be looking at these pictures. So we're going to call them follicles from now on. The only time we really talk about that secondary oocyte is during ovulation or fertilization. So similar type of growth process during puberty. Kind of those primordial follicles where we have this huge stash kind of halt, right? What's in there? A primary oocyte. How do we know that? Because we just talked about it. And then post-puberty, these primary follicles start developing. As we'll see, we'll select probably the best one to turn into a mature follicle, and only one will ovulate. Ovulations when this secondary oocyte is basically ejected, if you will, from the ovary. And then it goes down the fallopian tube and it goes into the uterus and the whole thing, maybe fertilized, maybe not. And then the cells that are left over, and we'll see this in another slide, all those cells, his buddies that he left behind, turn into a structure called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is important, especially if fertilization takes place, and we will mention that. So the big picture here is the difference between the oogenesis and the one cell versus the follicular development, which is not only that cell, but all of his buddies around him. Um, and that's what we see here, right? So as stated, the follicle is that community of cells, right? If you look at the top, I'm not going to try to write there because it's going to make me exit the screen again. But we have a lot of primary oocytes, right, upon birth. At puberty, some of them go away. But at puberty, we still have a lot of them. And around 400-ish will mature and ovulate during the reproductive lifetime. Once the ovulatory mechanism stops, you hit menopause, right? And we'll kind of talk about that as we move through a little bit and some of the potential issues associated with that. But every month, right, these follicles, you can see these. This is the follicular growth. This is not just showing the one cell. The one cell's in there. The one cell is this guy, right? That little white part on the inside of all those follicles. But they basically are all growing. One of them will become the ovulated secondary oocyte. So what we could see is the primordial follicles, which we stated. Primary follicles will continue to grow into a secondary follicle, which will continue to grow into a mature follicle. And we'll talk about that fluid that's in there in a little bit. Then you have ovulation. Ovulation, as you can see, is when that secondary oocyte is released from the ovary. These cells that remain turn into the corpus luteum. If fertilization occurs, that thing will stick around and do a variety of things. If fertilization does not occur, it starts to degenerate and turns into a structure called the corpus albicans, and then it basically goes away. So this is constantly happening post-puberty. We have two ovaries. They alternate back and forth. And that's the picture that is actually what's happening in relation to the slide we just covered. Right? So I put that on there specifically to show you the growth of the one cell and how that correlates to the follicles. Obviously, when we talk about the ovary, we're almost always talking about the follicles. So this is what a primordial follicle looks like. And what's significant, I will highlight. In that primordial follicle, we have our primary oocyte. Notice it's the one cell, but he's got a lot of buddies around him. And then he gets more buddies, right? So in the primary follicle, right, you have your primary oocyte. I thought that was going to show in here. More cells are accumulating around, right? We have the granulosa cells. Not that I'm going to necessarily, I could ask you some of these pictures, but I'm not going to make you, know every single structure on here. I'll highlight the important ones. The zona pellucida during especially the next section when we talk about fertilization in detail becomes very, very important. It's kind of this layer that sits around the primary oocyte and plays a very important role as far as adherence of sperm, acrosome reaction, and a bunch of other things. So that's kind of significant. We have these theca cells that we saw over here that will turn into the specific layer of the theca called the interna. This is important because these cells secrete estrogen. So when we talk about the ovarian cycle, the ovary, we will see as this thing's growing, estrogen levels are starting to increase. We already talked about that with the development of the uterus, right? So that will come back into play when we look at the chart. You can still see that zona pellucida, and you can see the antrum. The antrum is this fluid-filled space here. And that, for me, when I look at something, tells me it's a secondary follicle. And if the antrum's bigger, then we're looking more at a Graafian or a mature follicle. Again, you can see that primary oocyte in there. The corona radiata you will see probably in the next lecture. And these are some of the significant components of our secondary follicle. Now, what we're going to see is as we move from the secondary follicle to, this is just showing you a picture of one, to the mature or Graafian follicle, we still have those cells producing estrogen, right? We still have the antrum. Notice it's bigger, right? We still have the zona pellucida. We still have the corona radiata. The primary oocyte becomes that secondary oocyte. So when we talk about ovulation, what we are ovulating is that secondary oocyte. Now, this is the first time we're going to see this, and then we'll look at the chart. Ovulation is triggered by a hormone called LH, luteinizing hormone. So we have this surge, estrogen levels are increasing. We have this surge or spike of LH, and this is what triggers that ovulation. That's like the go signal. So very high levels of LH trigger or cause ovulation, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. And this is just showing you the three structures we talked about towards the end of that, from the mature follicle to the corpus luteum to the corpus albicans. But the big picture here is what hormones are being produced. That mature follicle had those theca cells that were producing estrogen. The corpus luteum, those remaining cells, turns into like this puffy cloud looking thing, secretes, and this is important, estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and relaxin. That's important, right? These will serve a certain purpose when we look at the next slide. And then the corpus albicans does nothing. He goes away, right? So we have these structures that are producing hormones at certain times, which leads us to this picture. It's tricky. I'm going to try to simplify it for you. So right off the bat, you have to see the big picture. All of this is happening at the same time, right? If we look at this point, oh, come on. If we look at I don't know why it's doing this. If we look at this point here, the ovulation, all of these things are happening at the same time. But they're happening in body temperature, the uterus, hormones released from the ovary. It's happening in the ovary, or it's under the influence of pituitary hormones. All of these things are happening at the same time. So this is showing a general representation of about 28-day reproductive cycle, right? You have I'm going to try not to, follicular phase and the luteal phase, right? Up here. The follicular phase we like to think of as the follicles are growing, right? And the luteal phase I like to associate with corpus luteum because that's when it's around. So there's a lot going on here. We'll try to help you out. The pituitary hormones right off the bat are FSH and LH. Like I said in the beginning, which hormone is the highest is going to be the most dominant hormone. So FSH stimulates the follicles. It's called follicle stimulating hormone. What are your follicles? The growth of the cells in the ovary. So it makes sense. So FSH is going to cause the growth of those follicles. Cool. What are those follicles producing? Estrogen. The more it makes, that estrogen goes up. Makes sense, right? What happens as that estrogen goes up? The proliferative phase of the uterus. Makes sense, right? When this estrogen goes up, maybe I'll just keep using the red one. You'll notice as that estrogen increases, it's going to trigger this. That pink line here is LH. So as previously stated, the increasing levels of estrogen trigger what we call the LH surge. What does that LH surge promote? Ovulation. Right? So it's a series of events all happening kind of in sequence, but in different areas, which makes it confusing. So is it a pituitary hormone? FSH, we talked about, helps stimulate the follicular growth. LH helps trigger ovulation. We already talked about the whole ovarian cycle and the growth of that. Then you have hormones produced by the ovary, right? So thinking now, we had that estrogen, starts to go down a little bit because we ovulated. What sticks around? The corpus luteum. What hormones are high? Not FSH and LH. Progesterone, which is that dominant hormone during the secretory phase, right? Or the luteal phase. Estrogen and inhibin. Where do they come from? The corpus luteum. No fertilization takes place. Everything goes down, right? Menses. Reset, and that's like the first picture we looked at with the uterus when the hormones are high and then they go down, triggers that menses, clear out that stratum functionalis, reset, start all over again. So this is what's happening in the uterus. This is what's happening in the ovary as far as hormones produced. This is what's happening in the pituitary, and this is what's happening specifically with the growth of the cells in the uterus. And obviously here at the bottom, just because we have it, we can see during ovulation there is a temperature change. Body temperature increases slightly. And some people can measure or recognize that to figure out when they're ovulating to maximize the potential contraception. Right? So this kind of doesn't summarize. This explains the whole thing I just explained. Right? So when we look at the menstrual phase, we got to think, what are we thinking of? Right? At the same time, when we think of the menstrual phase, we're thinking, right, more uterus, right? So we have the pre-ovulatory phase before, aka this is all in the beginning, right? Ovulation obviously is usually around day 14, and then the post-ovulatory phase is after. So big picture here, we are going in sequential order from menstrual, pre-ovulatory, ovulatory, post-ovulatory, and then clearly back to here, right? So let's break it down. We're using 28 days. This is what's going on. What I like about this is it shows what's happening in the ovary at the same time as the uterus. I really like that first picture, right? I like it. I think it's simple. It's not simple. It's complex, but it explains everything that's going on. And as long as you understand, the chart makes sense. The problem is it doesn't explain it. It just shows you the graph, right? So during the beginning, aka the menstrual phase, FSH levels are rising, and thus those follicles are maturing, right? From those primordial and primary follicles to the secondary. What's happening at the uterus? Menses. Your progesterone's down. We basically shed that stratum functionalis. We talked about that. What happens next? Pre-ovulatory. In between the menses and the ovulation, there's a period here. Usually lasts-ish 6 to 13 days, but very variable. What's happening in the ovary? The follicular phase. What does that mean? Follicles are growing. We have secondary follicles. They start to produce estrogen. The mature follicle is chosen. Call it a Graafian follicle. Estrogen levels start increasing because obviously the secondary follicles are making it. If you remember those theca cells. What's happening in the uterus? Proliferation, right? The rising levels of estrogen cause the growth of that stratum basalis, getting thicker, preparing. And we have that stratum functionalis, which we start to see, right? What happens next? Everything was preparing for ovulation. So what we have in the ovary is those increasing estrogen levels that were produced by the secondary oocyte growth, those follicles, stimulate GnRH and trigger the pituitary gland to release LH. This is the LH surge, right? That triggers ovulation. Rising estrogen, trigger LH surge triggers ovulation. Good to go. What's happening in the uterus? It's just chilling, right? Functionalis continues to grow, endometrium's thickening. Then we get towards the end. What's happening, right? We have the luteal phase, right? That was after ovulation when we had that corpus luteum, right? So what do we have? Formation of corpus luteum, right? The theca and the granulosa cells turn to the luteal cells, and these cells produce 4 hormones. We already talked about it. Estrogen, and we saw it on the graph as well. Estrogen, progesterone, which is obviously going to be the dominant hormone, inhibin, and relaxin. At the same time, what's happening in the uterus? It's getting really thick. And it's that secretory phase, right? Under the influence of estrogen and progesterone, starts to get the endometrial glands, starts preparation, right? In order to, if it doesn't know whether you have a fertilized embryo or not, but it's preparing to nourish it, and then you don't get fertilized, right? What happens? The corpus luteum makes these guys. We just talked about it, right? Corpus luteum will go away. There has to be something to keep it around. And I will explain to you what that is probably in the next slide or two. Here, the lack of or decreasing levels of estrogen and progesterone, because that corpus luteum went bye-bye, triggers that shedding of the functionalis. And this restarts. So we have the same thing that we just talked about 6 slides ago, right? The other ovary, FSH levels rise, promote the stimulation of the follicular development, right? Menstrual phase, progesterone and estrogen go down, functionalis gets removed. Menstrual phase. If fertilization does occur, this is the important part. That corpus luteum's there. It's making stuff. The presence of something called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which will be produced by the developing zygote, if you will, tells that corpus luteum that fertilization has occurred. If fertilization has occurred, we want to keep that corpus luteum around and have it make hormones, right? Because it sticks around, there's lots of estrogen and progesterone, which help keep that endometrium so you don't get rid of it, because now you don't want to get rid of it because you have something that's going to implant in it, right? So we could see here, basically, similar to the first picture, these are pituitary hormones, right? That's what they do. This is our ovarian cycle, aka what's happening in the ovary. This is our uterine cycle, what's happening in the uterus. We could see the menstrual, pre-ovulatory, ovulation, and post-ovulatory phases as a whole in the uterus specifically. We could see the menstrual, proliferative, secretory, and menstrual again, right? In the ovary, we could see the gradual maturation of the follicle, eventually leading to ovulation and the corpus luteum. And we can see the follicular and luteal phase of hormone regulation. So I like the first chart-ish better just because it has more on it. But this one's a nice little summary. This also summarizes what we said as far as what are the dominant hormones, what kind of happens. You can take a look at it, compares the proliferative versus secretory phase. It's a little cartoony. You have plenty of resources to figure it out, right? So estrogen is important. It doesn't only allow for, the things we talked about, right? It also is involved in secondary characteristics, right? Distribution of fat, pitch of voice, female growth patterns for hair. It's very, very anabolic and helps with bone growth and muscle growth. And we'll talk about that when we see postmenopausal osteoporosis. Postmenopause, those estrogen levels go down, and we see demineralization of bone, right? So we often see osteoporosis and osteoporotic-like bones. Not often, but it happens post-menopause, correlating to that lower levels of estrogen, and that just says how important it is to maintain your bone density. Estrogen also helps lower cholesterol by storing fat, like we just talked about. So it actually decreases the likelihood of coronary artery disease, which is awesome. And it helps rebuilding of the uterine wall for potential implantation, as we talked about with that new stratum functionalis. And then we get to the male, right? A little less hormones involved, if that makes sense. We have some videos, check it out, summarizes it pretty well. And we have some basic structures. Looking at this, we have let's see where it is, testes, aka gonads. The testes in general, I'll go with the red because it's a little bit brighter. The testes in general serve a couple purposes, but primarily today we're going to talk about them for testosterone production and sperm production, right? That's where the sperm production takes place. There's an epididymis over here. We have the vas deferens, right? Epididymis, vas deferens, and urethra. This is basically how the sperm travels out from the epididymis to the urethra, and then out, obviously, for ejaculation and sexual reproduction. We have a couple accessory glands, seminal vesicles, the prostate, bulbourethral glands, and obviously the penis and scrotum are supporting structures serving their purpose. Let's talk about it. The testes have to be outside the body, right? We are post-puberty producing a tremendous amount of sperm, and we need to keep them temperature regulated, right? So they need to be a little bit cooler than body temperature to allow those sperm good production and survival, so they don't basically get fried, if you will. So the testes have two muscles, the cremaster and dartos, that are involved in helping to regulate or thermoregulate the testes and thus sperm production, right? So the cremaster pulls the testes up when it's cold to keep them warmer, closer to the core of the body. And the dartos aid in that through wrinkling of the scrotum, also bringing the testes closer to the body. So both of these muscles you should be able to recognize as helping to thermoregulate the testes. we have a couple components in the testes. Number one, you have the tunica albugina, which is the outer cover. I don't talk about that as much, but you have the seminiferous tubules. These are where sperm are produced. And we'll take a look at a couple different pictures of them and how this works, but that's where the spermatogenesis is taking place, right? It will, once they are produced, go to the epididymis, where those sperms kind of chill out. They get stored, they mature here, they learn how to swim, and when necessary, these sperms will exit out through the vas deferens or ductus deferens during ejaculation when necessary for sexual reproduction. So looking at kind of a cross section of the testes, we can see these seminiferous tubules. And in between these seminiferous tubules, we have other cells. Right? These are where sperm are being made in those tubules. The other cells are called Leydig or interstitial cells. These cells produce testosterone. So number one function, sperm production. Number two function, testosterone production. When do these Leydig or interstitial cells produce testosterone? Under the influence of LH. So LH tells those cells to make more testosterone. That's it. Right? So here, this is our seminiferous tubule. And what happens from the outside in, we have a process called spermatogenesis. So from the first cells, which are going to be out here, to the actual sperm, which will be inside, is a process called spermatogenesis. Out here, we can see these interstitial cells. And this is a simplified version. The next picture, I think, goes into more detail. We know that the Leydig cells make testosterone. And there's another cell inside this region called Sertoli cells. And Sertoli cells are important because they produce, one, they're the nurse cells. They help this whole process of turning into sperm, providing nutrients, producing some chemicals. One thing that they produce is androgen binding protein. This will bind to testosterone and help keep it in this area. So if these Leydig cells are chilling, producing lots of testosterone, you don't want it just leaving, going away somewhere else. We need to keep it here to help regulate spermatogenesis. So the ABP will bind to that and keep it around, which is very important. And lastly, on this picture are our spermatogonium, if you remember from the oogonium an hour ago. These spermatogonium are the initial cells that will then turn into sperm. So they're going to undergo the same process that we see here, right? This is an okay picture. It's not horrible. I like this one a little bit better, right? Just because it's a little bit simpler. So this is spermatogenesis, right? So let's see if it gives you the... So we're going to start off with our spermatogonium. They're going to go to primary, secondary spermatocytes, spermatids. Does that say it on here? No. And then through a process of spermiogenesis, they will turn into the functional sperm called spermatozoa. So there's two terms we see here, spermatogenesis, which is from start to finish the production of sperm, and spermiogenesis, which is the finalization of those sperm as they enter the center of the seminiferous tubule, if that makes sense. So let me see if I could find you a list here. I should have pulled one up for you. It's all good. But these are our spermatogonia, right? Primary spermatocytes, secondary spermatocytes, spermatids, and then finally spermatozoa, which are your functional sperm. They have a head, they have a tail, etc. So here we look at the process of spermiogenesis, right? And this is the maturation of that spermatid to a spermatozoa. And you can see a couple key things here. One, acrosome, right? We have a flagellum, which is the tail that allows for motility and swimming of the sperm. The head, obviously, is going to be containing the nuclear material. If we recall, this sperm should be haploid, which means 23, as opposed to diploid, which means 46. So our gonia cells, I should probably do this on their page, but it's all good. Our spermatogonium, our oogonium, all those gonias were diploid. As you move through and they start kind of undergoing meiosis, we end up with a finalized product of gametes, which are haploid. So this kind of just explains the spermiogenesis, right? Kind of what material gets shedded off. I'm not going to ask you crazy questions about that, but we want it to be streamlined. We want to have a flagellum, have good fuel source, right? We have a lot of mitochondria and things like this in here to provide the energy to propel millions of sperm through the crazy adventure that they have through the uterus and fallopian tubes, etc. So this is the hormonal regulation of the male. A little bit less complicated. We do not have necessarily an ovulatory cycle monthly. We pretty much just have a consistent production of sperm post-puberty. So what happens, right? From the hypothalamus, we release something called GnRH, right? We talked about that with the endocrine system. And GnRH, yeah, or you will, releases or tells the pituitary to release FSH and LH. It's what it does. It's gonadotropic releasing hormone, stimulates the gonadotrophs to release FSH and LH. These gonadotropic hormones go into the blood. FSH works on the Sertoli cells, right? Produce ABP, etc., helping sperm production, right? The spermatogenic cells. And LH goes to the Leydig cells, which make them release testosterone. So FSH, think more sperm production, LH, testosterone. However, as I stated before, those Sertoli cells make androgen binding protein. So it can bind to the testosterone, keep it around so it can help us develop the sperm. So a little bit of that testosterone gets turned into DHT, which is a powerful form of testosterone that is responsible for male development, right? Enlargement of male organs, secondary characteristics, starting of puberty, protein synthesis, muscle building, hair development, you name it. So obviously the testes do make a lot of testosterone for secondary male characteristics, as well as helping with sperm production, right? Once you have enough sperm, we send a message like, yo, we're good. Once you have enough testosterone, yo, we're good. Negative feedback, on the hypothalamus. Stop releasing GnRH. Levels of FSH and LH go down. Life's good. That negative feedback control. The epididymis, right, is where we store those sperm. The sperm got made, right? That's what happened. They get stored here. They get kind of finalized. They get matured, if you will, and then they get released when necessary. During ejaculation, right? A peristaltic activity, aka the three layers of muscles of the vas deferens, help move the sperm through a relatively long pathway to get out through the urethra, right? If the sperm are stored here, they got to go out, up through here, down, around. They got to go down over here before they can come out, right? Hmm. So there are some other things we got to talk about. That is how sperm are produced. That is how hormones are regulated in the male and how they influence both male characteristics and sperm production. You learned about the Sertoli cells, the Leydig cells as some of those accessory cells, minus the spermatogenic cells. And here we talk about a vasectomy. So if you have your vas deferens, right? Um, if that's the pathway the sperms need to take, you could undergo surgery where you split that pathway. So obviously they won't be able to, even if produced, be released during ejaculation. Makes sense. The other mechanism for that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in kind of the next section, is tubal ligation. So obviously, if you can stop the pathway the oocyte would take going down into the fallopian tubes where fertilization would occur, clearly that would also be beneficial if you were trying to stop fertilization, right? There's non-surgical sterilization. So basically, you have this microcoil inserted, forms scar tissue and things like that. I'll probably pull these videos down. You don't really have to stress about the videos. And there are other contraceptive mechanisms from birth control pills that affect levels of estrogen and progesterone, to affect ovulation, as well as a multitude of other contraceptive mechanisms. Obviously, if you do not want to get pregnant, the most safe way to do so is to not engage in sexual reproduction, right? So sperm production, let's see if I can do this. Yes. We make a lot of them, millions of sperm. They're stored in the epididymis, and during ejaculation, right? They come out, and you can see that they pass through a few structures. I should say by a few structures. The first one are the seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicles make up a large component of the semen. The fluid is alkaline. It has nutrients as well as some other chemicals to provide fuel and to help neutralize some of the acidic environment that those sperm will be exposed to. As this comes down and through, right, they hit the prostate. The prostate makes up a quarter-ish of the semen, right? It has proteolytic enzymes, prostate-specific antigens, a few other chemicals. It makes it milky, and this prostatic contribution helps form functional semen. And we have the bulbourethral glands, which don't really contribute much, but they add to the mucus-ish component and a little bit more of the alkaline nature of that semen. If your sperm production drops, still seems like a lot, but less than 20 million sperm per milliliter, it is very, very difficult to have enough sperm to make it there to the egg for fertilization. We talked about the sperm pathway. We know that they're produced here in the seminiferous tubules. We know that they go out, they're stored in the epididymis. They go out the vas deferens, come through that seminal vesicle, prostate gland, and that bulbourethral gland will also provide slight contributions. And this will happen during ejaculation, which we will talk about in a minute. The prostate, which we just mentioned as far as contributing some of this fluid, can have issues. We have BPH, kind of benign prostatic hyperplasia. With age, this prostate kind of enlarges. You have prostate cancer. Either way, we know that the bladder and those vas deferens are sending fluids through. So when you have prostate cancer or BPH or something and that prostate is enlarged, it's going to make it very, very difficult and restrict the pathway that these fluids need to take, whether that's urine or semen, obviously. Lastly, when looking specifically at the penis, and we see this in lab as well, you have a couple different structures. Number one, you have the urethra. The urethra is the opening that we discussed that carries both urine and semen. Surrounding the urethra, and I think there's another picture after this that'll help you out a little bit, is a group of tissue called the corpus spongiosum. This is the tissue that surrounds, I think, spongy, kind of by the urethra, spongy, surrounds the urethra. And then the other tissue that's important is called the corpus or corpus cavernosum. And that is this area here. And this area has blood vessels, and it's very, very important for an erection, right? So we'll talk about that real quick. You can see the basic structures here, the urethra, the spongiosum. You can see those tunicas, which are basically just kind of the outermost layers. You can see that corpus cavernosum. You can see what it actually looks like inside. And now we'll talk about the erection and the neural control and the physiology associated with that, right? So when I approach this, I look at two things. Number one, you can have mechanical stimulation, right? These receptors will send a message, right, to that sacral spinal cord, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. If you recall when we talked about that a bunch, you have the pre, you have the postganglionic neurons. But this will cause arterial dilation. Blood vessels dilate, blood flow increases. Not only does it increase, we have compression of the veins, so it stays there. So what you have is those arteries, if you will, in the corpus cavernosum engorged with blood flow, leading to the erection. In addition, you have some of these hypothalamic or brain controls via the limbic system, thoughts, sights, smells, sounds, etc., that could also trigger that parasympathetic preganglionic neuron to lead to the same thing, right? Increase arterial blood flow, decrease venous leave, thus results in the erection, right? So this just shows the dilation of those arteries. More blood flow comes in. The corporal tissue, aka corpus cavernosum, swells, leads to the erection, and those veins constrict, keeping that blood flow in there. There are various types of medications as far as treating erectile dysfunction or issues associated with that pathway we just discussed. One of them is PDE5. So you kind of have this cycle here where we have an increased blood flow, and then this enzyme, right, phosphodiesterase, is responsible for kind of shutting it off, right, if you will. What we can do, there you go. These drugs inhibit this enzyme, thus keep an increased in blood flow in the erectile tissue, and thus maintaining the erection, right? The ejaculation component, right? The erection's half of it. The ejaculation component is a sympathetic reflex as opposed to the erection, which is a parasympathetic reflex. And there's a quick summary there, but we talked about all the fluid contributions, the peristaltic activity. Makes sense. Post-ejaculation, there is basically a refractory period where we need to recharge more or less, kind of reestablish all the nervous stimulation and kind of re-prepare, if you will, before a second ejaculation can occur. And that kind of wraps it up for the female reproductive system, hormones, structures involved, and the male reproductive system, hormones, and structures involved. With that being said, I'm going to stop this one, get to studying, and the next one we'll talk about is fertilization. See you then.